let's firstly contextualize the improvements that we've seen. Of course, it is an improvement. More people being employed, up 24,000, 22,000, what is 25,000 versus Q1. But overall, South Africa far ahead of emerging market peers when it comes to unemployment rate.
Well, far higher, certainly, in terms of the negative. So if we compared it to other emerging markets, and you can compare South Africa to any country in the world, then we're going to have really high unemployment, but it does make sense to compare it to our peers. They're structured in a similar way in some cases, countries like Brazil and so on. We're much higher, significantly higher. South Africa's unemployment rate sits at around about 25%. It's really sticky. Even in the good years, it went down to about 20% in terms of people that were looking for jobs who couldn't find them. So that's really high. It's really, really high.
When we take a look at the provinces, there are discrepancies though. I mean, if you just look at the Free State, highest unemployment rate there, around 30%, and looking at KwaZulu-Natal, the best unemployment rate. How do you explain the discrepancies across the key provinces?
Well, it's a very similar to story how we'd explained the national level unemployment and the difference between the countries. South Africa suffers from a structural unemployment level. So, you get different types, and frictional unemployment is one type where people are looking for jobs and they're temporarily unemployed, but structural unemployment is the bad type where people are permanently unemployed for long periods of time. So that's what South Africa experiences, and on the regions you get the same thing. An area like Gauteng has got a very different structure to another area like, say, the Free State. KwaZulu-Natal's got a very different structure in terms of the way they're made up. And in terms of, and when economists talk about structural unemployment, what they're really talking about is the mismatch between the demand for skills and the supply of skills. So in your metro areas, you've often got higher demand for skills, and you've got more education there, so you've got the right sort of supply of skills meeting that demand. So you sometimes get slightly lower unemployment in those regions. You'll see, for example, Tshwane's unemployment rate is a little bit lower than the rest of the other metros and lower than the national average, which is good. But other areas suffer from really high unemployment rates, and it's really a lot to do with these structural issues. What sort of services they provide in those areas. Do they mine? Are they resource intensive?
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the economic nature of the zone, the region where we have high unemployment. Take us through some of the regions where we're seeing exceptionally high unemployment. For example, Bushbuck Ridge in South Africa versus, for example, Rustenburg. We've got actually very low unemployment, sitting below 10%.
Yeah, Rustenburg's employment is, it's kind of a good news story in South Africa. You've got about 7 or 8%, depending on the way you cut it and how you measure it, maybe a little bit lower. So that's a good news story, and it's got a lot to do with platinum mining is okay, and the long-term trend now seems like it's going through a bit of a dip, but on the whole, platinum mining is doing well. There's more people being employed there. There's people moving into the area and still being employed, so that's a good sign. But another area, like for example Machabeng, or you mentioned Bushbuck Ridge has very little going on. It's a very, very rural economy. There's not a lot of services there. There's very little in the way of access to jobs, firstly, so that's from the demand for employment side. And on the supply side, there's very little access to the ability to uplift oneself. There's very little education possibilities there.
So ultimately, based on this kind of micro approach to looking at the unemployment figures, you have to take a look at what is taking place structurally within these economic zones and how you can address the unemployment problem from perhaps a bottom-up approach.
That's one way you could look at it, and I think I do agree. That's probably a more sort of it's a better approach to look at it than to say, well, let's cut interest rates, or well, let's just change labor regulation. South Africa's unemployment is very structural in nature. Either cutting interest rates or changing labor legislation, or there's lots of different things that are proposed all the time. None of those by itself is going to make any difference, and each of them, even if we were to do the whole range, are going to make small differences here and there. Even good proposals like changing labor legislation, making the markets more liberal, that would be great, but by itself isn't going to make a big difference. What we need is a proper structural change in South Africa, where we need to have the right demand for labor meeting the right supply of labor. So that's all about skills, it's all about the right type of businesses, it's about creating the right environment for labor.
Yeah, and it's all about education. Only 7.2% of unemployed people in South Africa actually have a post-matric qualification. We're going to have to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining us, David Wilson, Senior Analyst at IHS Global Insight, South Africa.